The morning light slid gently across the Georgia countryside, spilling over acres of pine trees and red clay roads, glinting off the strands of barbed wire that enclosed a quiet camp. Inside, rows of barracks stood in perfect symmetry, their wooden frames painted a dull army green. Beyond the fence, men in khaki uniforms laughed in a language foreign to the South, German. They were prisoners of war, captured soldiers of Hitler's army, now sipping hot coffee in tin cups, smoking cigarettes, and waiting for breakfast. Bacon, eggs, and bread, all served warm. Some even smiled at the guards, who nodded back in casual camaraderie. The enemy had found comfort here, thousands of miles away from their shattered homeland. Just a few miles down the road, another man in uniform approached a small diner in his hometown. His uniform was American, olive drab, worn, and dusted from travel. A patch on his shoulder bore the symbol of the U.S. Army. He had returned home on leave after 2 years overseas. The smell of fried food filled the air as he stepped toward the door, but before his hand reached the handle, a white man blocked his way. "Not for your kind," the man muttered, jerking his thumb toward a sign nailed above the door. "Whites only." The soldier stood still for a moment, then lowered his gaze, turned around, and walked back into the heat. His name was James Williams, a private first class in the United States Army, and though he had risked his life under the same flag, he was treated as if he were the enemy. In the heart of America's Deep South during World War II, a quiet contradiction lived and breathed. Captured German soldiers, men who had served the Nazi regime, were granted dignity and rights under the Geneva Convention. But black American soldiers, who had volunteered to defend that very freedom, were denied the simplest forms of respect in their own homeland. It was a paradox so staggering that even decades later, historians still struggle to explain how the land of liberty became a place where the enemy was treated better than the loyal. By 1944, the war in Europe had turned decisively against Germany. Thousands of Nazi troops were surrendering, and the Allied powers faced a practical problem: where to keep them all. The United States agreed to take in nearly 500,000 prisoners of war. Camps sprang up in remote corners of the country, far from the fighting. The South, with its wide stretches of farmland and mild winters, became an ideal location. Georgia alone hosted more than 40 camps scattered across its counties. For many locals, it was the first time they had seen real Germans, tall, pale men who spoke in clipped syllables and saluted with precision. The U.S. military followed international law to the letter. The Geneva Convention of 1929 required that POWs receive proper housing, food equal to that of American troops, and humane treatment. In many Georgia camps, the prisoners enjoyed 3 meals a day, medical care, and access to sports and education programs. Some even played in orchestras or painted murals on the walls of their barracks. A few towns allowed them to work on local farms, earning small wages that could be spent at the camp canteen. To many Southerners, the sight of these Germans, polite, disciplined, white, did not provoke hatred. Instead, some townspeople treated them with a kind of strange curiosity or even warmth. Farmers, short on labor because of the draft, found the POWs to be hardworking and respectful. One farmer's wife in Troup County once told a reporter, "They're better mannered than the colored boys we used to have." She meant it as a compliment. The irony was unbearable. At the same time, black Americans in Georgia were still living under the iron rule of segregation. The Jim Crow laws governed every detail of life: where you could eat, where you could sit, which schools you could attend, even which fountains you could drink from. For black soldiers in uniform, returning home from Europe was not a celebration. It was a painful reminder that their sacrifice changed nothing. When African American troops arrived at southern train stations, they were often forced to ride in the colored section at the back of the bus, even when the front rows were occupied by German POWs. Soldiers who had fought side by side overseas suddenly found themselves separated by race at home. One veteran recalled in an interview decades later, "The Germans we captured were treated like guests, we were treated like dirt." The paradox was visible everywhere. In some army bases, dining facilities were segregated, not by rank or duty, but by race. White American soldiers and even German prisoners ate in the same hall, while black soldiers ate outside or in separate tents. At one camp, an African American driver was ordered to transport German prisoners to a work site. When the truck arrived, a white officer told him, "You can't sit up front with the prisoners, get in the back." So he did. The enemy sat in the front, the Americans sat behind. This reality sparked quiet rage among black soldiers who had believed in the promise of the war. They had signed up under slogans like freedom for all and democracy versus tyranny. But when they looked around at their own country, They saw tyranny in a different form, one built not on occupation but on prejudice. Newspapers like the Pittsburgh Courier launched the WWII campaign, calling for victory against fascism abroad and victory against racism at home. It became a rallying cry for thousands of African Americans in uniform who refused to remain silent. Private James Williams was one of them. Born in Macon, Georgia, he had joined the army in 1942, inspired by the idea that fighting Hitler's ideology would prove that black men deserved full citizenship. He served bravely in Italy, where local villagers treated him with respect he had never known in the South. They didn't see a color, he wrote in a letter home. They saw a man in uniform, but when he returned home on leave, the same uniform marked him as a threat. He once stopped by a general store outside Atlanta to buy a soda. The clerk refused to take his money, saying, "We don't serve your kind in uniform." As James stepped aside, two German POWs, escorted by an American guard, entered the same store. They bought cigarettes and candy without trouble. The owner smiled as he handed them their change. For James, that moment shattered something deep inside him. The war he thought he was fighting was not just in Europe, it was here, on the dusty roads of Georgia. Still, he tried to keep his pride. He walked back to the camp where he was stationed, watching as trucks full of German prisoners passed by. They waved through the open slats, laughing, their faces tanned from the Georgia sun. It was not the sight of the enemy that haunted him. It was the realization that they were freer than he was. The contradiction was not confined to Georgia. Across the American South, similar stories unfolded in Alabama, Texas, Mississippi, and Louisiana. Reports from the War Department noted complaints from black soldiers who were refused service in restaurants where German POWs dined freely. One officer wrote privately, "It's hard to justify to our Negro troops why the enemy gets a hot meal and they do not." But nothing changed. The system was too deep, too ingrained, too accepted. To white Southerners, the Germans were still white men, a shared race, a familiar hierarchy. The logic of segregation was stronger than loyalty to the flag. It wasn't about patriotism, it was about color. That was the unspoken truth of the American South during World War II. At Camp Gordon near Augusta, German prisoners spent their days cutting timber and tending fields. They received small paychecks and could attend religious services on Sundays. Local pastors often preached to them, calling them lost souls deserving redemption. Meanwhile, black soldiers stationed at the same base were assigned to kitchen duty or janitorial work. They cleaned the floors the POWs walked on. Some historians later described this as America's moral dissonance, nation that fought fascism while tolerating its own brand of racial supremacy. But for the men who lived it, it wasn't theory, it was daily humiliation. They saw the hypocrisy in every handshake between a white American and a captured Nazi, every polite smile exchanged over a fence that separated the so-called enemy from the supposed ally. Yet even amid that injustice, there was resilience. Black soldiers continued to serve with pride, knowing their service carried a meaning deeper than orders and medals. They were fighting for a future that might not yet exist, a freedom that they had to prove was real. In the letters they sent home, they spoke not of defeat, but of hope. "If I die over here," one wrote, "maybe my brother won't have to sit at the back of the bus anymore." As the war dragged on, the paradox deepened. German POWs grew comfortable in their camps, forming baseball teams, learning English, even performing plays. Some guards admitted that they liked the Germans. "They're decent fellows," one said in an interview. "They don't cause trouble like the colored boys." The statement revealed everything about the time, who was considered human and who was not. By 1945, the contrast had become a national embarrassment. Journalists began to expose the hypocrisy in print, calling it a moral war within the war. But most Americans preferred not to look too closely. The country wanted unity, not introspection. Yet beneath the patriotic slogans and victory parades, men like James Williams carried a private wound, one that no medal could heal. The South had hosted the enemy and treated them with civility. It had also raised sons who bled for the nation, only to be treated as strangers in their own land. And as the war neared its end, the question lingered like smoke over the red Georgia hills. Who truly represented America's values? The men in the camps behind barbed wire, or the soldiers barred from a seat at the table? America had fought tyranny overseas, but tyranny still lived quietly under its own flag. The war in Europe was nearing its violent end when the full absurdity of America's racial paradox came into view. Across Georgia and the broader South, German prisoners, once hailed as the embodiment of the enemy, were now part of the local fabric. They worked on farms, played in orchestras, and were invited to Sunday dinners by white families who, only months earlier, had cheered the bombing of Berlin. Meanwhile, the very soldiers who had captured these men, African Americans who wore the same US uniform, saluted the same flag and risked their lives for the same cause, were eating outside, sleeping in segregated quarters, and being refused service in towns they had sworn to protect. It was a dissonance so vast it bordered on surreal. The enemy, protected by international law, was treated better than the patriots denied by their own. This was not just irony, it was a mirror held up to the American soul. Behind the barbed wire of Georgia's prisoner camps, life followed a rhythm that surprised even the prisoners themselves. At Camp Wheeler near Macon, mornings began with a bugle call. Prisoners lined up for roll call, saluted, and then moved to breakfast: bread, jam, coffee, sometimes eggs. The barracks were clean and heated in winter. Many POWs were given English classes, some joined orchestras or built furniture in workshops. They painted murals on the walls, played soccer in the fields, and even organized Christmas concerts that drew curious locals. It didn't feel like prison, one former German POW would later say. It felt like waiting out the war in comfort. The guards, most of them young Southern white men, treated the prisoners with civility. Some even enjoyed their company. German POWs were allowed to write home and receive packages. When they were assigned to local farms to pick cotton or cut timber, they were paid small wages. Farmers offered them lemonade in the heat, and women from nearby churches sometimes brought baked goods. "They're decent Christian boys," a pastor in Carroll County said of the Germans. "They were misled by their leaders, that's all." The same compassion rarely extended to Black Americans working in those same fields. African Americans, many of whom had lived on that land for generations, were still sharecroppers trapped in cycles of debt. When Black and German laborers worked side by side, they were not treated equally. A white foreman might scold a Black worker harshly for resting too long in the sun while offering a cigarette to a German POW. The hierarchy was unmistakable. White skin, even that of an enemy, meant worth. The US Army justified its treatment of POWs through the Geneva Convention. The same army justified segregation through tradition, and the difference was law versus culture, and culture was stronger. The paradox grew sharper within the military itself. On bases throughout the South, German prisoners and white American soldiers often shared mess halls, while Black soldiers were sent to eat in separate tents or outside altogether. In one documented case at Camp Clinton, Mississippi, a bus carrying German POWs stopped at a roadside cafe. The prisoners were allowed inside to eat. The Black American guards escorting them were told to wait outside. Stories like this reached the War Department in Washington. A few sympathetic officers complained, arguing that it undermined morale, but the institution shrugged. Segregation was just how things were. For Black servicemen, the insult was deeper than policy. It was personal. They had believed in the WWII campaign: victory abroad, victory at home. It was more than a slogan. It was a dream that service would earn them equality. But as they watched German prisoners stroll freely in towns where they couldn't even vote, that dream began to die. The irony was felt even more strongly by those who had seen Europe firsthand. Many Black soldiers stationed overseas experienced freedom for the first time in their lives. In England, France, and Italy, they walked into cafes without being refused. Local civilians thanked them for their service, shook their hands, and invited them into their homes. There were no colored-only signs, no segregated train cars, no whispered insults from the people they protected. The contrast was unforgettable: liberation abroad, humiliation at home. When those men returned to the United States, the air itself felt heavier. The moment their ship docked and their boots touched American soil, they re-entered a world that denied their humanity. Even their uniforms could not protect them. In 1946, a Black veteran named Isaac Woodard was beaten and blinded by police in South Carolina for asking to use a restroom. His attack shocked the nation, but it was only one of many. The system's cruelty extended beyond individuals. The post-war GI Bill, meant to reward veterans with education and housing benefits, was implemented through local authorities in the South, meaning that many Black veterans were denied access. White veterans attended college and bought homes in new suburban neighborhoods. Black veterans were turned away by banks, colleges, and realtors who simply refused to serve them. The war had ended, but the hierarchy remained. Back in Georgia, the POW camps were winding down. The war in Europe was over. Germany had surrendered. But inside those camps, a strange peace remained. The Germans played music, read newspapers, and waited to be sent home. Many had developed a fondness for the United States, not because they agreed with its politics, but because they were treated as human beings. Some even said they feared returning to Germany more than they feared staying in captivity. "I was a prisoner," one wrote, "but I never felt imprisoned." Outside the camp fences, black veterans were being denied service, housing, and even protection from violence. In several towns, returning black soldiers were attacked for wearing their uniforms in public, a sign of pride that white supremacists saw as defiance. Their courage overseas had earned them medals, but at home it earned them beatings. The contradiction was so glaring that it began to draw quiet attention in Washington. A few northern journalists wrote exposés about it, calling the situation America's invisible front line. One editorial in 1945 asked, "What kind of democracy frees Europe but chains its own citizens?" It was a question few dared to answer. For many Southern whites, race was not a matter of morality but order. They viewed the Germans not as racial inferiors, but as misguided cousins who could be redeemed. Black Americans, by contrast, were seen as permanent outsiders, a threat to the Southern social system. This warped racial logic made it possible for the South to extend courtesy to Nazis while denying civility to its own. Camp Gordon in Augusta was one of the starkest examples. There, German POWs were occasionally allowed to attend church services with white civilians. The congregation prayed beside them, offering redemption to men who had fought under the swastika. But when a group of black soldiers requested to attend the same church in uniform, they were turned away. The pastor cited local custom. In his sermon that day, he preached about forgiveness. This hypocrisy was not lost on the black soldiers themselves. Some began keeping diaries, writing letters, and documenting what they witnessed. They knew their experiences would be forgotten if they did not speak. Private James Williams, still stationed near Macon, wrote to a friend, "Sometimes I think the Germans have it better than us because they don't expect anything. We expect freedom. That's what hurts." Williams often drove supply trucks between bases. On one trip, he stopped at a checkpoint guarded by 2 white MPs and a group of German POWs clearing brush along the road. When he asked for passage, one guard looked at him and said, "You'll wait until they're done." So he did. The POWs finished their work, nodded politely, and climbed into their transport truck. Only then was Williams waved through. It was a small moment, but it burned itself into his memory, a reminder that uniform color meant less than skin color. As months passed, the situation bred bitterness. Many black soldiers began to question the ideals they had been taught to defend. "How can we fight for freedom," one sergeant asked, "when freedom doesn't fight for us?" Yet rather than surrender to despair, they began to organize. The experiences of war had given them new discipline, new awareness, and a sense of solidarity that would later fuel the civil rights movement. The WWII campaign had planted seeds of resistance, and those seeds were now sprouting in veterans' halls, churches, and communities. Black veterans returned to their hometowns and began to challenge injustice directly. They registered to vote, filed lawsuits, and joined the NAACP in record numbers. They had seen a world without segregation, and they knew it was possible. Still, the paradox persisted. When the last German POWs left Georgia in 1946, many locals expressed sadness. Some farmers wrote letters to the War Department asking if they could sponsor their return as laborers. Newspapers described tearful goodbyes between guards and prisoners. One article quoted a white farmer saying, "Those boys were good workers. I'll miss them." There were no articles written about the black soldiers who left the same county that week. Even years later, when those camps had been dismantled and the fences pulled down, the memory of that contradiction haunted those who had seen it. Some German prisoners later spoke about it with disbelief. "We were treated better than the Negroes," one former POW told a historian in the 1980s. "It was confusing. We were the enemy." The confusion was not theirs alone. For America, it was a shameful mirror that reflected its deepest hypocrisy. The claim of freedom, contradicted by its practice. The soldiers who bore that contradiction on their backs began to change history simply by refusing to accept it. By the late 1940s, black veterans had become catalysts for justice. Medgar Evers, a World War II veteran, returned home to Mississippi determined to fight segregation. Others followed. Men who had carried rifles in Europe now carried petitions, marching not through enemy lines but through streets lined with hostility. They were still soldiers, but their new battlefield was America itself. In the classrooms of Georgia and the fields where POWs once worked, the ghosts of that paradox lingered. Some locals forgot, others denied it ever happened. But the men who lived through it remembered every detail: the taste of rejection, the sting of injustice, and the bitter irony of fighting for a freedom that excluded them. As one veteran put it, "I went overseas to free people I didn't know, and I came home to people who still wouldn't free me." The war had ended, but for many the struggle had only begun. The camps were gone, But the memory of who was treated as a man and who was not would outlast the fences and the flags. For the black soldiers of World War II, the battle for equality would become the fight of their lives, a second war, fought not with weapons, but with truth. When the war ended in 1945, the camps in Georgia fell silent. The same barbed wire that once separated enemies now sagged in the humid air, rusting under the southern sun. The German prisoners packed their belongings, handmade carvings, photographs, letters home, and boarded trains that would carry them toward the coast and eventually back to Europe. As they waved goodbye to the guards and the farmers who had come to see them off, they left behind something far heavier than memories, a moral question America would not confront for decades. For many of those German prisoners, captivity in Georgia had been oddly pleasant. They had been fed, protected, and even befriended. When they reached Germany, some spoke fondly of the United States, marveling at how well they had been treated. One wrote in his diary, "I came here as a soldier of the Führer. I leave as a man who has seen real civilization." The irony was painful. He had seen it at the expense of those who built that civilization but were denied its benefits. Meanwhile, thousands of black American soldiers were also returning home. Men who had fought at Normandy, Anzio, and the Ardennes. Men who had carried stretchers through shell fire and dug graves for their fallen brothers. They stepped off trains wearing uniforms heavy with medals, their hearts filled with hope that the nation they had defended might finally see them as equals. But America greeted them with the same segregation signs, the same slurs, the same laws that had mocked their sacrifice before they ever shipped out. The streets they returned to were not lined with parades, but with silence. In small southern towns, a black man in uniform was still seen as a provocation. Some veterans were beaten for refusing to take off their uniforms in public. Others were lynched simply for standing tall. In Monroe, Georgia, a group of returning veterans were dragged from their car and murdered by a mob. No one was ever charged. The message was unmistakable. The war may have been over, but the system remained. And yet, out of that cruelty, something began to stir, a quiet, unyielding determination. The men who had faced the horror of war refused to surrender to fear at home. They had seen what hate could do when it wore a uniform and carried a flag. They knew what it meant to fight tyranny. Now they would fight it on their own soil. Among them were men like Juan Medgar Evers, who had stormed Normandy and returned to Mississippi to register black voters. Charles Hamilton Houston, a veteran who turned his discipline toward law, laying the groundwork for Brown versus Board of Education. Jackie Robinson, who had served as a lieutenant and refused to give up his seat on a segregated bus even before Rosa Parks made history. Their courage in war became the fuel for the civil rights movement. The battlefields had changed, but the mission had not. The contrast between how German POWs and black soldiers were treated had not gone unnoticed. Historians, journalists, and even foreign visitors began to question America's moral authority. How could a nation claim to lead the free world when freedom itself was segregated? The Cold War only sharpened that question. As the United States sought to win hearts and minds across Africa and Asia, Soviet propaganda eagerly pointed to photographs of black veterans beaten in their own country. The world saw the hypocrisy, even when America tried to hide it. In Georgia, most of the POW camps were dismantled by the early 1950s. The barracks were torn down, the fences removed, and the land returned to farmland. But here and there, fragments remained, concrete foundations, rusted nails, and the faint outlines of where the enemy once slept peacefully. For years, few people spoke about them. It was easier to forget, but history, as it always does, waited patiently to be rediscovered. In the 1980s, local historians began unearthing records, letters, and photographs from the Georgia camps. What they found reignited the old paradox. One historian, Dr. Anthony Martin, uncovered a photograph of German prisoners enjoying a picnic under a tree, smiling with local civilians. On the back, someone had written, "Our boys from Germany." The same year, he found a letter from a black veteran to his congressman describing how he'd been denied a seat at a restaurant next door to that very camp. Two worlds side by side, divided not by loyalty but by color. When these stories surfaced, they stunned a new generation of Americans who had never been taught about them. Schools began to include them in local history programs. Documentaries aired short segments about the POWs of Georgia. Though few delved into the racial implications, for many, it was still too uncomfortable to face the truth that America's sense of justice had once extended more easily to its enemies than to its own defenders. Yet slowly, the silence began to break. In some Georgia towns, residents held ceremonies to acknowledge the forgotten history. At one such event in Troup County, a black veteran stood before a small crowd and said, "We don't tell this story to shame our country. We tell it to teach it." His words captured the purpose of remembering, not revenge, but reckoning. The paradox of the German POWs and black soldiers reveals more than historical irony. It exposes the fragile nature of morality when shaped by prejudice. America's adherence to the Geneva Convention was a noble act. Its adherence to segregation was a moral failure. Together they show how a nation can be lawful and unjust at the same time. The German prisoners were treated decently, not because America loved them, but because international law demanded it. Black Americans were mistreated because domestic law allowed it. And yet within that contradiction lies the seed of change, because the same veterans who endured that humiliation would one day become the architects of progress. Their service, ignored in the moment, became undeniable in hindsight. When television cameras captured marches in Selma and sit-ins in Greensboro, they showed men and women who carried not just signs, but the discipline of soldiers. The war had trained them to endure hardship, to organize, to fight without surrender. They turned those lessons inward onto a nation still learning what freedom really meant. By the time Martin Luther King Jr. marched through Georgia in the 1960s, the ghosts of those old POW camps were long gone, but their legacy remained, invisible and heavy. King's dream of equality echoed the unfulfilled promise of those black soldiers who had fought 20 years earlier, the dream that loyalty to one's country would be repaid with justice. He often said, "We cannot be satisfied until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream." For the veterans who remembered standing outside whites-only diners, those words were not poetry, they were prophecy. Today, traces of those camps can still be found: half-buried foundations, forgotten graves, rusted tools once held by hands that belonged to both the enemy and the oppressed. In some small museums, photos of smiling German POWs hang beside the letters of black veterans who demanded equal rights. Together, they tell a story that is as uncomfortable as it is essential, a story of a nation at war with others and with itself. Modern historians view this paradox as one of the defining moral failures of the 20th century. It stands alongside Japanese internment and the Tuskegee experiment as evidence that even in times of great unity, America's conscience was divided. Yet acknowledging that failure is not a condemnation, it is a responsibility. The strength of a democracy is not in its perfection, but in its capacity to face its own reflection without turning away. The legacy of those black soldiers lives on in ways they may never have imagined. The military they once served in segregation is now one of the most integrated institutions in the country. Black officers command fleets, divisions, and even entire branches. The progress is undeniable, but so is the cost. Each step forward was paved by men who returned from Europe and found the enemy waiting at home, not in uniform, but in policy, in law, in silence. The story of German POWs in Georgia and the black American soldiers who watched them from across a fence is not just a footnote in history. It is a lesson about how nations define humanity and who gets to belong. It is a reminder that freedom, if it excludes even one person, is incomplete. As we look back now, the paradox forces us to ask hard questions. How many times have we fought for ideals abroad while ignoring them at home? How many sacrifices have gone unacknowledged because they did not fit the narrative of triumph? History is not kind to forgetfulness, and silence does not erase injustice, it only delays its reckoning. That is why this story must be told, not to dwell on shame, but to confront truth, because remembering is a form of honor, and forgetting is a form of betrayal. If we stand today in a field in Georgia where one of those camps once stood, we might hear nothing but the wind moving through the trees. The fences are gone, the guards are gone, the laughter of the prisoners has long faded. But if we listen closely beneath the quiet, we can still hear two kinds of footsteps, those of men who came as enemies and left with dignity, and those of men who came as heroes and left with scars. The moral of this forgotten chapter is not despair, it is accountability. The same courage that led men like James Williams to wear their uniform with pride must lead us, even now, to confront the unfinished work of equality. The past cannot be changed, but the truth can still be honored. Because history's power lies not in comfort, but in confrontation. It reminds us that democracy is not self-sustaining, it demands vigilance. The next generation must learn not only what America won in World War II, but what it almost lost, its moral clarity. So when we teach our children about the war, we should tell them about Normandy and Iwo Jima, but also about Macon and Augusta, where prisoners dined while patriots waited outside. We should teach them that freedom is not a flag, It is a promise that must be renewed by every generation. And if there is one call to action that this story demands, it is this: remember. Remember the paradox, remember the soldiers who endured it, and remember that equality delayed is equality denied. Let this history inspire vigilance, empathy, and the courage to speak when silence feels easier.